All right, welcome to our class on Herman Melville's Moby Dick, which was a novel that was published in 1851. Melville had met Hawthorne. Here he is. Hawthorne was a bit older. He was born in 1804, died in 1864 at the age of 59. Melville, on the other hand, was born in 1819 and died in 1891 at the age of 72, so he outlived him by quite a while. So Hawthorne dies in 1864 while Melville is in the middle of very difficult financial straits. He has to sell his house in that year to, or just slightly before that, to his brother, Alan Melville. And then he and his family moved to New York City at that point. So the trajectory of Melville's life is kind of interesting. He was born in 1819, and it was in that year that the whale ship Essex was rammed and sunk by a sperm whale. And so that's where the whole story of Moby Dick comes from. But he conflated it together with Joshua Reynolds' accounts in a periodical Knickerbocker on Mocha Dick, which is the name that was given to a whale, an albino whale, that was seen off the coast of Chile and was normally friendly unless provoked, and if you provoked it, it would attack you. And then so he sort of combined those two. The whole story of the Essex, which we'll get into as the class goes on, is fascinating too. Because in that case, that narrative, and it was by written by Owen Chase, or ghost written for Owen Chase, and published in 1821, and Melville got a hold of that account of the sinking of the ship. That begins the story there, where the whale sinks the ship, the Essex, and the men who survive, I think there's something like 20 of them in 3 different small boats, survive for several months. It may have been as long as 3 or 4 or 5 months, somewhere in there, on the sea, diminishing, dying, and then having to resort to cannibalism and so forth. So that's a very different story than what Melville tells, because his book ends with the sinking of the ship and the wiping out of everyone. Everyone dies except for Ishmael, who's the first-person narrator. So Melville, let's see, I have a chronology of him here. His father went bankrupt early on when he was about close to 12 years old, and then died 2 years later. I guess he's about 13 at that time. So his father dies. Now I noticed something interesting, a little psychological detail. The father's name is spelled without the E at the end, Melville. So Melville adds the E at the end. In similar fashion, Hawthorne did the same thing. He added the W into the middle of his name to distance himself from his ancestor, Hawthorne, who pronounced over the Salem witch trials. So the motivation in both cases seems to be very patriarchal, like a rebellion against patriarchy. And both authors have that in common, this rebellion against patriarchy. So let's take a look at his chronology. So then, as the father dies, he has to go and take a bunch of odd jobs, substitute teaching at schools, working as a clerk in a bank, all these kinds of odd jobs before he decides in 1839 to go to sea with the merchant marine ship, the St. Lawrence. He travels, I believe, to England on that first voyage from across the Atlantic, from New England to England on that first trip. And then a couple of years later, he takes a major journey, a 3-year journey, supposedly 3 years, on the Acushnet, which he signs up for. They leave from Fairhaven, Massachusetts, and they travel through Polynesia. And because life on board the ship is so severe, Melville says that he abandoned the ship together with a friend, and the friend turns up as a character named Toby, his sidekick, the sidekick of Tomo. His name is Tomo in Typee, his first novel, which is an account, a fictionalized autobiographical account of his time spent amongst the Marquesas Islanders, the Polynesian natives. They treated him very well, despite their reputation of being cannibals. And they were cannibals, but only against their enemies. So when you get to the book Typee, which is his first book, published in 1846, it was a huge bestseller. It did very, very well. And it remained his most famous book until the time of his death in 1891. So he was always known as the guy who lived among cannibals. So he had this exotic reputation as this sort of pioneer. Gauguin follows him later on But he's sort of the one to pave the way here for Western culture in this anthropological interaction with the Marquesas Islanders, who, as I say, treated him very well. But so he and his companion jumped ship. He was only with them. In the novel, he's with the Polynesians for about 4 months, I think. But in reality, it was only about 3 or 4 weeks. But he learned a lot about them, and he wrote the book, and it's very compelling reading. I just read it for the first time, finished it a couple days ago, having read it for the first time. It's an excellent adventure novel. It reads like a bestseller. It moves along very quickly. It's not like with Moby Dick, which is kind of a cross. It's a hybrid between fiction and nonfiction. Indeed, originally Moby Dick was going to be just a nonfiction account of whaling and the mechanics of whaling and how you do it and so forth. But Hawthorne was reading the manuscript and he said, you should turn this into a novel. And so he did. So the fictionalized aspect is sort of another stratum in Moby Dick that's built on top of the geologic bedrock, you might say, of a how-to whaler's manual. And so there's a little bit, when an author hybridizes 2 or 3 different genres, it can become very difficult, like the way Goethe in Faust Part 2 hybridizes the drama with the epic. And consequently, it's very, very much less popular than the first part, even though it's 1,000 times greater than the first part. But it's a similar thing, the difference between Typee and Moby Dick. And with Moby Dick, that hybridization, it confuses people at first because there's a shock of the new that they don't know what to make of. I think the reactions to Faust Part 2 and Moby Dick are very similar. It takes a while for those works to work on your subconscious and to you have to sort of osmotically absorb them. It's a very slow, gradual process. It's not a bestseller action car chase movie, or in this case, boat chases, or whatever you want to call it. So it was so successful that it allowed him to get married to Elizabeth Shaw, and they bought a house, did the whole thing, spending money. So he wrote a sequel to it, of course, called Omu. It's based on his time spent on the island of Tahiti and a nearby island where he was working a potato plantation. And then, so that was a big bestseller as well. So those first 2 were home runs, just right out of the starting gate. He was only 26 years old when he wrote them. So then he follows them with Marty, and all of these, almost all of Melville's novels and a great degree of the short stories are nautical. They're based on the sea. They take the sea for granted as its ontological canvas, or as Deleuze and Guattari would call it, its body without organs. So we have Marty and Redburn. Though Marty didn't do well at all, Redburn was a modest success, as was also White Jacket, which was based on one of his voyages. And then so after that, this is 1850, and he moves right up the street from Hawthorne. The 2 become friends, and they're trading works back and forth. You know, it's interesting, I think, to compare Hawthorne and Melville. I think they're both equally great. They were 2 of the greatest giants that American literature has ever produced. I've read almost everything by Hawthorne. Hawthorne starts out with short fiction in the 1830s, at the same time that Edgar Allan Poe is writing short fiction and inventing the genre of the detective story, horror fiction, science fiction. Poe is an enormously inventive and fertile writer. This is also the same period as Thoreau and Emerson. This is the sort of first generation of American literature that put us on the map as we can do it just as well as the Europeans can. These guys established that. Twain is second generation American literature. Twain contributes more of the informal Huck Finn, grammatical errors, spelling errors, all that kind of thing, informality, and Walt Whitman as well. So, let's see. So those 2 meet, and Hawthorne puts out The Scarlet Letter in 1850. It took him a while he had a novel before it, I think The Blithedale Romance, if I remember right, and then, but he's an absolute master of the short story. There are lots of stories in there like Young Goodman Brown that we would regard as horror fiction, which it is, more or less. There's a whole bunch of stuff like that in the collected short stories of Hawthorne. I've read them all. They're all amazing. And then The Scarlet Letter works as a very nice climax to the whole development. And he follows that with The House of the Seven Gables, which is another classic about the Pynchon family that Thomas Pynchon is vaguely related to. So Moby Dick then is finished, 1851. It's published, and it's crickets. It's just crickets. Nobody understood it. Nobody got it. It was way too hard to read. It switches back and forth between fiction and nonfiction. It has this great storyline that seems like it got submerged by all these philosophical digressions, chapters and essays on the symbolism of whales, the symbolism of the color white versus the color black, all this kind of wonderful stuff that nobody understood. Nobody got it at all. And so it flopped. And then he wrote another novel, which I think maybe which I haven't read, Pierre, which may be his first non-nautical novel, which also flopped. It's heavy on symbolism and allegory, but it flopped too. So at that point, then he starts turning to short stories. And I think it's interesting that Hawthorne starts out with the short story and then moves to the novel. Melville starts out as a master. If you read Type E, it's very impressive for a writer's first novel. He starts out as a master of the novel, and then out of career frustration shifts to writing poetry on the one hand and short fiction on the other. But his first short story that he publishes, Bartleby the Scrivener, is surely one of the greatest short stories ever written. I absolutely love that story. The story about the clerk in a 9-to-5 office who's stuck in the grind, and he says, no matter what his manager asks him to do, he says, I would prefer not to. And he gradually just sort of withers away, this passive, rebellious resistance, once again, to patriarchy, to the machine. So both of these guys are rebels against the whole patriarchal machinery. Then he publishes a couple of obscure novels. One is Lost, and then the other one, Israel Potter, comes out. It's a short novel. Nobody wants to read it. Nobody cares. And then The Confidence Man, which also fails to gain any attention. Then he sets sail again, it looks like, here in 1863. Now remember, Hawthorne dies the next year in 1864, the same year in which he is deeply in debt and behind on his mortgage payments, so he's forced to sell his house, Arrowhead, to his brother Alan, and then moves with his family back to New York. And of course, that year is the year of Hawthorne's death at age 59, probably from alcoholism. Hawthorne was a wineaholic. And then he goes to visit a friend on the front lines in the Civil War, and it leaves a huge impression on him in 1864. So he was right in the middle of the Civil War, and he does some writings about it, nothing that amount to very much, battle pieces and aspects of the war. So when he comes back from the Civil War, he takes a job at the New York Customs House, where he works for the next 20 years. Now, Hawthorne had that same job. He was also working at a customs house, checking ships at the dock and going through, and it's all items and inventories and all of that kind of thing. But at least he had a stable job here. I guess it was a stable 9-to-5 job for 20 years, the last 2 decades of his life. He has a tragedy in 1867 when his oldest son, Malcolm, commits suicide. He shoots himself, but it's unclear whether the shooting was intentional or accidental. It was probably intentional. There was an air of depression about Melville in these last years of his life. He was depressed quite a bit, almost constantly. And then, as I say, he dies in 1891 while he's in the middle of working on a wonderful short novel called the title has slipped me momentarily. But some of these, Billy Budd the Sailor. It's an excellent book. And he has a lot of really good short fiction, too, such as, in addition to Bartleby, he also has Benito Cereno, which is another nautical going story. It's a short story, kind of a novella. It's a long short story. And some others, such as the Encantadas, and lots of other stuff there. Melville was kind of, his topics, other than the continuous theme of sailing and nautical voyages, when it comes to his short stories, the topics are kind of all over the place. So it confused people, and they weren't generally very popular either. And so when he died in 1891, he was noted as, the obituary of him said that he was a long-forgotten author, the author of the Type E, the guy who spent time amongst cannibals. Okay, so that's our introduction to Melville going in. I think that gives us a nice overview. Here are the works in chronological order: Type E, Omoo, Mardi, Redburn, which is a fictionalized autobiography of his first voyage. And then White Jacket, Moby Dick in 1851, Pierre, 1852. Isle of the Cross was never published, but the manuscript is lost. We just know word of it. And it was the only only one of his novels to feature the viewpoint of a female protagonist named Agatha. She was the first person protagonist of that novel. There's not a lot of female protagonists in Melville. Unlike the energies are much more masculine with Melville than they are with Hawthorne, where the energies are much more female because he's got all this sympathy for what happened with women in the Salem witch hunts, and it wasn't just women who were persecuted in that situation, but the Scarlet Letter is in a way of kind of karmic balancing for his incarnation as his great-great-grandfather, John Hawthorne, the one who presided over the witch trials. And then and the great short stories, Bartleby, the Encantadas, Benito Cereno, which is a wonderful novel about a revolt on a Spanish slave ship captained by Don Benito Cereno. It's excellent. All of his best works, with the exception of Bartleby the Scrivener, which takes place in a 9-to-5 office, are on the sea. That's just where he felt at home. The difference between Hawthorne and Melville is a little bit like the difference between Homer and Hesiod. Hesiod is a landlocked Boeotian farmer writing about very old mythologies, dialoguing with very old Boeotian Greek mythologies, whereas Homer is an island man, supposedly blind, but he was out on the islands and in touch with the sea. And of course, with the Odyssey, writes the greatest sea epic ever written. Moby Dick is up there, and it's sort of aiming for that kind of greatness. And then these last few novels here. Okay, so I think that gives us enough of an overview of Melville that we should be all set to begin the discussion in class. I'll see you in class.